In January of 1973, Christina Onassis lost her only brother, Alexander, after a plane crash. In October of the following year, her mother, Tina, died in Paris. 5 months after that, her father, Aristotle Onassis, was dead too. Fewer than 26 months took all three of them, and left Christina the surviving heir to one of the most famous and most complicated fortunes in the world. Newspapers filed the deaths under a phrase that stuck: the Onassis Curse. It was a useful phrase, mostly because it let people fold grief, illness, financial power, family duty, and plain human uncertainty into one dramatic idea and stop thinking about it. Nothing here is going to prove or disprove a curse. This is the story of how Christina Onassis inherited an empire in the same stretch of months that took the family who built it, and of what happens when the world assumes money should make a woman immune to loss. Welcome to Gilded Women, where we look past the beauty, the money, the marriages, and the scandal to find the woman behind the public image. Christina Onassis was born in New York in December of 1950. She belonged to 2 shipping empires before she was old enough to know what one was. Her father, Aristotle Onassis, had built an international fleet by taking risks other ship owners wouldn't. Her mother, Athina Livanos, called Tina, was the daughter of Stavros Livanos, another of the big names in Greek shipping. The marriage tied those 2 names together in a business where a ship was never only a ship. It was an investment. It was collateral against a loan. And it was a piece of prestige for a family and sometimes for a country. Christina and her older brother, Alexander, grew up inside a life almost no child would recognize. The family moved between New York, Paris, Monaco, and Greece. Guarded houses, schools abroad, private planes, and the yacht that carried Christina's name. In 1963, Aristotle bought the Greek island of Skorpios and turned it into a family retreat. From the outside, all of it read as freedom. Christina could go more or less anywhere in the world, which is not the same thing as having somewhere to be from. The whole operation ran on movement. The ships crossed oceans. The business was done in several countries, and the family shuttled between houses, hotels, offices, and ports. That opened doors, and it also meant home was split across a lot of addresses and a lot of competing loyalties. Calling that childhood a fairy tale would be false, and so would calling it a prison. It gave her privileges most people never see, inside a family whose private life ran in the international press. Her parents' marriage ended in 1960. By then, Aristotle's relationship with the opera singer Maria Callas was already part of the public story about the family. In 1968, he married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of President John F. Kennedy. In most accounts of Aristotle's life, both women are more famous than his daughter. For Christina, what mattered about them was the machinery they came with. Her father's private decisions turned into front-page news, and millions of strangers felt entitled to an opinion about who her family was. There's no need to invent lonely scenes to fill that childhood in. The documented outline does the work. Her parents were divorced, her father's relationships were public, and the surname drew a crowd wherever she went. So Christina was living inside a reputation built by adults long before she inherited anything from them. She was educated in Europe and spent time around the family businesses, which is where she would have learned that the name did not run on glamour. Behind the yacht and the island and the photographs sat contracts, banks, insurers, crews, lawyers, and a fleet working across borders. For most of her youth, though, Nobody expected Christina to be the one who carried the name. That was her brother's job. Alexander Onassis was born in 1948, 2 years ahead of her, and in the male world of 20th century shipping, the elder son was the conventional successor. Aristotle had built the empire on personal authority, hard bargaining, and a network of men who had worked with him for years, and Alexander was the child who fit into that line without anyone having to think about it. He didn't sit around waiting for it either. As a young man, he moved into the aviation side of the family's interests and eventually ran Olympic Aviation, a regional subsidiary of Aristotle's Olympic Airways, as its president. Flying gave him a job that was practical and symbolic at once. He was the son learning the machinery from inside it. The assumptions of the era put Alexander near the future of the business and put Christina in the papers as a young heiress whose marriage would be the main event of her life. Which is why January of 1973 changed more than the emotional life of the family. Alexander was injured in a plane crash at Elliniko Airport in Athens and died in late January, age 24. The official history of the Onassis Foundation describes it as a severe blow from which Aristotle never recovered. For Christina, this was, before anything else, the loss of her only brother. It also rearranged everything around her. The expected successor was gone, and every question about who would keep the businesses running, who would hold the family name, and what would happen to the fortune slid one seat closer to her. The succession problem was visible to anyone reading a newspaper. What nobody could measure was what it felt like to become more important to an empire because someone she loved had died. She had not stepped into a clean vacancy. She had stepped into an absence. Alexander had been raised toward that inheritance, and what the family would now want from the daughter who outlived him was an open question. She wasn't given long to sit with it. Alexander's death opened a run of losses packed so tightly together that it later looked designed for legend. Aristotle went on doing business after the crash, but relatives and the Foundation's own history agree that losing his son hit him hard. Diagnosing a dead man from this distance would be irresponsible. What is safe to say is that the death reshaped his last years. The future he had planned for the Onassis name was gone, and he started building a different kind of legacy around Alexander's memory. Christina's mother had made a life away from Aristotle after the divorce, still tied to the Livianos shipping family and to the same international world Christina had grown up in. In October of 1974, Tina died in Paris at the age of 45. The accounts of what killed her have never fully agreed, and later retellings have leaned on that gap to make the Onassis story lurid. The narrow version is the only one anyone can defend. The death was sudden. The precise circumstances are described differently depending on the source, and Christina had lost her mother less than 2 years after burying her brother. That needs no embellishment. At 23, she'd buried 2 members of her immediate family while her father's health was failing. She had houses, staff, money, and access to the best professional help available, all of which was real, and none of which changed who was gone. 5 months after Tina, on March 15, 1975, Aristotle Onassis died at the American Hospital in Paris. He was 69. He was buried on Scorpios, near Alexander. From Alexander's death in late January of 1973 to Aristotle's on March 15, 1975, is fewer than 26 months. That interval gets blurred every time the family history is retold in a hurry. The 3 deaths were not spread across some vague stretch of several years. They came one after another, and Christina was still short of her 25th birthday when the last of them happened. The sequence got read as proof of a curse because the word made the pattern feel like it had been explained. It hadn't. Alexander died after an aviation accident, Aristotle after a period of declining health, and Tina in circumstances the reporting has never made consistent. Filing all 3 under one mysterious force erases the differences between them, and it erases what actually happened to Christina, who did not live through a headline. She lived through 3 separate bereavements. Her public identity changed almost overnight. Before Alexander died, she had been a daughter and a sister inside a great shipping family. After Tina and Aristotle, she was presented as the family's surviving center, and the press had a simple-sounding job title for her, the Onassis heiress. The job itself was considerably messier than the phrase. Aristotle's fortune was international and structurally awkward. Ships, companies, real estate, cash, securities and interests held across jurisdictions. All of it carrying obligations. Somebody had to make decisions about management, taxation, debt, and the charitable foundation Aristotle wanted established in Alexander's name. Christina had not been handed one account with an impressive balance. She had inherited a position inside a system. She was expected to protect a name that meant her father, to handle the men who had advised him, and to understand an estate built partly to honor the brother whose death had moved her into line. By the spring of 1975, grieving was something she was going to have to do alongside the work. Most retellings of the inheritance open with one enormous number. Aristotle left more than $1 billion, the story goes, which plants the image of the world's largest personal bank account being signed over to a single person. The image is misleading. A later detailed account of the estate put gross assets above $1 billion, covering hundreds of millions in cash and securities, more than 50 ships, real estate, and business interests in several countries. The same account put outstanding liabilities at roughly $421 million, much of it loans against ships and property, and estimated the estate's actual value at Aristotle's death at about $500 million. That is still an extraordinary amount of money. Christina was not financially powerless, and there is no honest way to tell this story as though her life resembled the life of a woman with no money, no lawyer, and no social influence. Her resources opened doors, absorbed mistakes, and paid for litigation on a scale almost nobody else could reach. Gross assets and personal cash are still different things. A tanker can be worth a great deal while carrying debt and running costs. And a building only earns if somebody is managing it. A company can be extremely valuable while its ownership is divided and its decisions belong to boards, contracts, and advisors. A fortune spread across the world produces power and obligations in roughly equal measure, and the obligations cannot be put in a handbag and carried away. Aristotle's will complicated the structure further. The estate was meant to support 2 legacies: Christina's inheritance and a foundation established in memory of Alexander. The executors split the assets into 2 large and approximately equal lots. Christina was allowed to choose between them, and the remaining lot went to the foundation. The foundation was not a plaque on a wall. It was built with a business arm to generate income and a public benefit arm to spend that income on education, culture, health, and social welfare. Alexander's name would carry on through an institution funded by part of the commercial wealth his father had created. So Christina got a great fortune of her own, and a major piece of the Onassis legacy sat next to it under a mission attached to her brother. The catastrophe that made her the surviving heir is the same one that gave the estate a permanent memorial. Management of both groups of assets went to 4 senior advisors who had served Aristotle through his business career. On paper, this was practical. These men knew the companies, the ships, the loans, and the relationships the whole thing depended on, and a sudden disruption after his death could have damaged the value of everything he left. Seen from where Christina stood, continuity meant something else. She was the heir, and the machinery of control was still in the hands of men her father had picked. The wealth came to her. Uncomplicated command did not. She had also inherited a business culture built around one man's personality. Aristotle's authority came from ownership, but it came just as much from decades of personal bargaining, favors accumulated, and judgments made in rooms Christina had never been in. A will can transfer shares and legal rights. It cannot transfer 30 years of somebody else's experience and loyalty. Even assuming every advisor behaved properly, Christina still had to work out how far to trust a system whose most important relationships had belonged to her father. So her problem was bigger than learning to read a balance sheet. She had to tell the difference between respecting continuity and simply doing as she was told, without damaging the assets that both her inheritance and Alexander's foundation depended on. What she did about it cuts against the familiar picture of a passive young woman overwhelmed by money. According to a detailed history of the estate, Christina threatened legal action unless she was given oversight of the management of her own assets and of the foundation in her role as its president. The trustees agreed rather than risk prolonged litigation that would have held up the foundation's creation. That is not the behavior of someone with no agency. She understood that legal standing plus inherited wealth gave her leverage, and she used it. She did not dissolve the structure or replace every manager, and there is no evidence she was independently running every vessel and company. What she got was a chair from which she could scrutinize the men handling the legacy. That left her holding a contradiction she never put down. The fortune limited her, because every decision came wrapped in advisors, public interest, and questions of succession. The fortune also armed her, because it paid for the means to challenge exactly those limits. Calling the money a cage and leaving it there is too easy. It bought safety, mobility, professional help, and influence. It also made privacy hard and trust unreliable. Every relationship came with a second question underneath it. Is this person here for Christina or for Onassis? The executors could divide an estate into lots. Nobody could do that with a person's motives. That problem had shown up in her private life well before she became the principal heir. Her 4 marriages were later filed as a run of failures, proof that she was restless or spoiled or impossible to satisfy. It made easy copy. It also skipped the question of what marriage might have meant to a young woman whose surname was doing the talking at every introduction. Her first husband was Joseph Bolker, an American real estate developer, considerably older than she was. They married in 1971, when Christina was 20. Aristotle strongly opposed the match. The marriage was over inside a year. Nobody gets to read a private motive with certainty, but the timing invites a question. She was still the daughter of a commanding father, and she married a man her family did not want her to marry. It may have been an attempt at independence, or at making one decision that was hers, precisely because it broke the family plan. That doesn't make it a wise decision or an unwise one. It makes it more than a line in a catalog of scandal. At 20, she had wealth and was still subject to her family's authority and expectations. And marriage looked like a way to acquire an adult identity outside that structure. When it ended, she came back to private disappointment and to a public world ready to treat the whole episode as evidence about her character. The second marriage came in July of 1975, only months after Aristotle's death. Alexander Andreadis came from another prominent Greek shipping family, which meant his world was already hers, the same language, the same networks, the same business culture. Motive is guesswork here too, but the context is worth having. She had just lost her father and taken on responsibility for an international inheritance. A husband from a comparable shipping background might have looked like stability inside a world she recognized. Nobody would have to explain the Onassis fortune to him, and he already understood how tangled ships, family, and identity get. The marriage ended the following year. Contemporary reporting put the breakup down to money or conflict or temperament, and any of that may have played a part, but the verified outline is more modest. Christina married from inside the Greek shipping elite during the most unsettled period of her adult life, and it did not last. The third marriage went somewhere else entirely. In 1978, she married Sergei Kauzov, a Soviet shipping official. It drew international curiosity because it crossed lines of wealth, politics, and lifestyle all at once. She was associated with private capital on a spectacular scale. He worked inside the Soviet system. No newspaper was going to leave that contrast alone. A lot of the coverage treated the marriage as an oddity before it had a chance to become a relationship. Rumors collected around Kauzov, the way they did around anyone who got close to Christina, and rumor is not evidence. You don't have to cast him as a fortune hunter or a spy to explain why the public found the marriage fascinating. The contrast may have been part of the appeal for her. A life attached to Moscow and to a man from outside the familiar circle of Western socialites could have promised some distance from the role she knew too well. That's an interpretation and not a documented confession. What is known is that she moved into a markedly different environment and tried again to build a marriage beyond her family's conventional expectations. It lasted less than 2 years. The divorce went on to the public record with the others, and it also showed something about the power of her surname. Changing country, political setting, and social circle did not make Onassis disappear. The fortune came along. By the time she married Thierry Roussel in 1984, she was neither a rebellious young bride nor a newly bereaved heir. She was in her 30s and had spent years living with the consequences of the estate. Roussel was a French pharmaceutical heir, so for once, she was with someone who came from substantial wealth himself. That did not remove the question of trust, but it changed its surface. He was not arriving from a life entirely outside privilege. The fourth marriage gave her something the first 3 hadn't. In January of 1985, she gave birth to a daughter, Athena. For the first time since the deaths that had broken her original family, There was a new direct family bond and a new generation of the Onassis line. The marriage went badly wrong anyway. Published accounts describe Roussel's continuing relationship with another woman, with whom he had children, as the central source of the rupture. They divorced in 1987. It would be easy to run this stretch as a drama about betrayal and money. The more revealing thing is the question that had trailed her through every marriage. How was she supposed to know whether a private relationship was actually private? The four husbands differed in age, nationality, background, and connection to the shipping world, which rules out any single sweeping explanation. There is no sound basis for claiming all four married her for the fortune, and none either for treating Christina as a bystander to her own choices. She had the means to choose, and she used them repeatedly, including when her family or the public disapproved. Freedom is not the same as certainty, though. She could hire investigators, lawyers, and financial advisors, travel anywhere she wanted, and leave a marriage whenever she chose. None of that gave her direct access to what another person actually intended, and the larger the fortune got, the harder that question became. The marriages usually got read as proof that she was unstable or impossible to satisfy. The other reading is that she kept trying to build a private life in which the name Onassis would not determine every relationship, and kept finding that the fortune had come into the room ahead of her. Athena's birth changed what Christina's life meant, emotionally and dynastically. The child was born on January 29, 1985, and Christina named her after her own mother, Athena Livanos Onassis, the woman the world had known as Tina. The name connected 3 generations. It carried the memory, and it marked a beginning at the same time. Much of Christina's adult life had been spent being described as the last surviving child of Aristotle Onassis. Now she was no longer defined only by survival. She was a mother, responsible for someone whose future mattered beyond any question of ships or shares. The world, predictably, saw another heiress. Athena had been born into wealth so large that her inheritance was part of her public identity before she could speak. Reading it only as succession misses what motherhood meant to her. After her own family collapsed, here was a relationship that did not begin with loss. The Onassis future stopped being an abstract argument about ships, foundations, and inheritance. It was a child she could hold, none of which should be turned into another fairy tale. No public record proves that motherhood healed every wound, and declaring her a perfect mother because it makes a moving story is no improvement on declaring her a cursed one. What the record supports is that Athena became central to the final years of her life. After the divorce, Christina kept custody, and Roussel stayed part of their daughter's life. Motherhood also tangled the fortune up again. Christina knew better than almost anyone that a child can inherit wealth long before she can understand what it does. She had lived through the arguments about who manages an estate, who advises an heir, and who speaks in the name of family continuity. Athena's existence meant those arguments would not end with her. There was a more private strain running underneath. Christina's public image had always been measured against the ideals imposed on wealthy women. Be beautiful, marry correctly, continue the family, look grateful for the privilege. Having a child satisfied one of those expectations and released her from none of the others. Her marriage was disintegrating, and the press went on treating her domestic life as part of the Onassis property. The photographs of mother and daughter gave the public a softer story than the earlier headlines about divorce and inheritance. The practical situation behind them was harder. She was trying to keep her daughter's bond with Roussel intact while the marriage ended, and published accounts suggest she stayed emotionally attached to him well after it had turned painful. That comes from the people around her rather than from her, and it should be read that way. What the daughter gave her was a relationship no advisor had chosen, no family had arranged, and no business contract had produced. It also gave her something new to be afraid of. The woman who had inherited because her brother died now had to think about what her own child would one day inherit from her. Having an heir did not resolve the question that had followed her all her life, which was whether a secure private world could be built inside a fortune that existed for public attention. Answering that fairly means getting past the image that dominated the coverage. She was cast over and over as the unhappy heiress, the woman who had everything and could enjoy none of it. Poor little rich girl showed up constantly because the phrase does all the explaining for you. It turns a contradiction into a caricature. The privilege was real, and so was the grief, and recognizing one does not require denying the other. She was not an ordinary employee who had earned her way into a shipping office unaided. The name brought immediate access, and the ownership gave her authority. She also did more than spend money and get married. Accounts describe Aristotle bringing her into the business more deliberately after Alexander died. She attended meetings and got exposure to brokers, insurers, shipyards, and shipping operations. Once she inherited, she worked with the senior advisors responsible for the estate, and how much of the day-to-day she actually handled depends on which account you read. Calling her the single operational mind behind every part of the Onassis enterprise would be an exaggeration. Saying she knew nothing and merely signed whatever men put in front of her would be false in the other direction. Her demand for oversight is one concrete measure of how engaged she was. She could see that nominal ownership without information left her dependent on the people who controlled that information. Pressing for a supervisory role was her way of saying she was more than the beneficiary of her father's decisions and had a legitimate claim on understanding and influencing what happened next. None of that interested the press much. Corporate structures don't photograph well, and a negotiation with advisors has none of the instant drama of a wedding, a divorce, or a change in appearance. Reports about Christina kept coming back to her weight, her romantic life, her spending, and the size of her fortune. Her body got used as public evidence in the ongoing argument about whether wealth had made her happy. She was not the only woman this happened to, but the Onassis name magnified it. A wealthy man's marriages get written up as adventures. A wealthy woman's get presented as proof of emotional failure. A male heir who challenges his advisors is forceful. An heiress doing the same thing risks being called difficult. That doesn't make every criticism of Christina sexist or false. She made consequential decisions, and privilege protected her from a lot of ordinary consequences. A balanced history has to leave room for her agency and her errors. Restoring her complexity does not require promoting her to business genius or to saint. It requires something simpler, letting her be powerful and vulnerable in the same lifetime. The fortune handed her tools, and it guaranteed that almost any use she made of them would be read as another episode in the Onassis legend. In 1988, Christina traveled to Argentina and stayed with friends outside Buenos Aires. Argentina held an important place in the history of the family fortune. It was there that Aristotle, arriving decades earlier as a young refugee, had begun the commercial rise that eventually made the Onassis name famous. Her presence there near the end of her life closed a historical circle the press could not resist. On November 19th, she was found dead at the home where she was staying. She was 37. The first official reports gave the immediate medical finding as acute pulmonary edema, an accumulation of fluid in the lungs. The judge overseeing the inquiry made clear that investigators were still waiting to determine what had caused it. Chemical and pathological tests were not complete. Later testing found traces of a barbiturate in samples taken from her body, and the report at the time stated that the amount had not yet been determined. Pulmonary edema can result from more than one cause. None of that establishes an overdose, and it certainly does not establish suicide, murder, or a plot. The distinction is essential because uncertainty pulls stories toward it. Christina had been written about for years through family doom, troubled marriages, health, medication, and immense wealth, and a sudden death let every one of those threads be gathered back together under the easiest available label. The curse covered everything by accounting for nothing. It said nothing about the mechanical and human circumstances of Alexander's aviation accident, nothing that resolved the conflicting accounts of Tina's death, nothing about the illness and decline that preceded Aristotle's, and nothing that answered the medical questions still open after Christina's autopsy. What it did explain was the public appetite for a pattern. Great wealth comes with a cultural fantasy attached that whoever holds it has escaped ordinary life. So when death or divorce or illness or grief turns up in that world anyway, people go looking for a reason grand enough to match the fortune. Misfortune gets promoted to destiny. A family gets promoted to a dynasty. And a series of separate human events gets promoted to a curse. For Christina, that framing did one last thing. It made her death look like the completion of a story that had begun before she was old enough to have a say in it. She became another Onassis tragedy instead of a 37-year-old woman whose precise cause of death was, in the reports available at the time, still under investigation. Her body was returned to Greece and buried on Scorpios, the island her father had created as a private refuge, near Aristotle and Alexander. Athena, only 3 years old, became the heir to Christina's estate, which put the same combination of childhood, wealth, and adult control that had shaped Christina's own life onto another generation. Christina Onassis did inherit an empire. Assets of extraordinary value, legal power, international mobility, and a name that opened almost any door. None of that should be softened, and her life cannot be used to suggest that wealth and poverty create equal burdens. They do not. She also inherited obligations, advisors, family memory, public scrutiny, and the expectation that she would preserve what her father had built. She inherited it because the person originally expected to succeed him had died first. And she took the role on, while mourning her brother, her mother, and her father in rapid succession. The fortune gave Christina choices without telling her whom to trust. It financed houses and could not produce a stable marriage. It paid for the best care available and could not reverse a death. It made her visible everywhere, while most of her actual work stayed out of frame, which is where the familiar labels fall apart. Remembering her only as a cursed heiress or as a rich woman who could not be satisfied leaves out most of her. She had immense privilege and real agency. She was also a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a business owner, carrying one bereavement after another inside a public identity strong enough to stand in for the person herself. If this changed the way the phrase, the Onassis Curse, sounds to you, subscribe to Gilded Women, where we keep looking past the fortune, the marriages, and the headlines for the woman history reduced to an image. Christina Onassis inherited extraordinary wealth. Nothing in the estate protected her from being human.